and let everybody know about some of the new and improved things that we're doing and some of the things that we've done in the past. Real quick, I would like to say hello to recognizing Brandon Wolf, State Controller. He's here, and Representative Anderson and Senator Sidaway. And Senator Tibbetts is there too. Great, good to see you. And I just want to say hello to them. There are several other senators and representatives here, but they're on the panel, and I'll let Jim Weatherby introduce those folks because he's the one that's going to be dealing with those folks. And so just wanted to say hello and welcome to everybody. And this presentation is going to be streamlined through public television, and you can see that on our website, which is tax.idaho.gov. And you can get to that website and go ahead and log into this, and you can actually see this through public television. So that really, and what I want to do at this point is to introduce one of our feature speakers, and that's our chairman, Rich Jackson. And this is going to be done by pre-recorded video. Rich Jackson is at the multi-state tax meeting down south somewhere. And one of the main things they're going to be dealing with, of course, is marketplace fairness. And it's a real important thing to all of us here in Idaho, and it's streamlined sales tax is what it is, or it's multi-state and marketplace fairness, and it's a big issue to some of the local taxpayers, and so that's where he is. But at this time, I'm going to let our people go ahead and put him on and let him make a few opening remarks here. So go right ahead.
Good afternoon and welcome. For the first time, our annual meeting is being streamed statewide. This year we chose a theme of sense and sensibility, the dual role of the tax agency. As tax administrators, we walk a very tight rope. On one hand, we're collecting our taxes and enforcing the law. On the other hand, we're being educational and sensitive to the needs of the taxpayer. We have a desire to be forward-thinking. We have a desire to improve and work very hard to be sensitive and professional. We want to take this opportunity this year to do something totally different. And we have an open discussion about our dual roles. We want your input on how to improve the state tax system. As you're aware, Commissioner Langhorst and myself participated in the request for the Office of Performance Evaluation to give us an independent view. All 4 commissioners welcomed that review that was released this morning. We will start by looking at the steps that we have taken and what we're planning to do for the year to come. We'll follow with a brief overview of the legislation and the process of negotiated rulemaking. More important, we want your thoughts and input. We have a panel setting so that we can have a lively discussion and debate and your participation by those of you attending. We look forward to your valuable input and thoughts. If you happen to be a viewer, please send us your thoughts. Again, welcome to our meeting. We're pleased that you could attend, and we hope that you leave with a better understanding of our roles as tax administrators for the great state of Idaho.
Okay, thanks, Rich. That was great. But he's down there at the streamlined sales tax thing down at the multi-state, as I said, and he's getting some good information there as to how to maybe look at some of that implementation, which is real important to some of our local businesses. The other thing I need to do is introduce our ELT, our executive leadership team, and they're all right here in the front row and a couple in the back row there, your second row. So if you just stand up and wave your hand and let the audience know. Well, okay. These are the folks that really run the agency. These folks really are the nuts and bolts of this agency, and they provide their technical skill and know-how and workability and day-to-day working knowledge on putting the taxes on the table for the rest of the state. And so we appreciate all that you do very much. You're terrific people, terrific. Your state's really lucky to have them here, and they do a great job for all of us. Okay. At this time, and as I said, we're happy to have you all here, especially coming out in this cold weather. You know, there's nothing much colder than tax collectors' hearts, and we're here to show that there's a little compassion to the tax commission. And David Langhorst is going to come up right now and talk about compassion and fairness and equitability in terms of tax collection. So here's David right now. Senator.
Tom, thank you. That's not what my speech is about at all. So, I appreciate that introduction, and it's good to be here for my 5th annual meeting of the Tax Commission. Time flies. And even though I am to talk about the year in review, I'm actually going to take us back a little bit further. Most of the years, we focus on the information that's in here, and we go down to some more granular detail and give you facts and figures. We're not going to do that today. We have a little bit of a different meeting today, and so do take some time to look in there. And some of the things you'll see are that in fiscal year 2013, revenues increased by 6.2% over the previous year. You'll also see something that gets overlooked a lot, I believe, and that is Alan Dornfest, one of our staffers, produces a tax burden study every year. And it shows that Idaho is very low in terms of our tax burden, both on the national and compared to western states. So that may be of interest to you. Next slide. Some things that are not in the annual report I'll talk about real briefly. These are the things that kind of made 2013 a little different than some other years. The legislation that we were presented with this year, of course, every year there's tax legislation that we need to implement. This year we had a couple of real challenging subjects that you'll hear a little bit about, more about later. One was the personal property tax and how to define it. What things are personal and what are real property. That's been an interesting and resource-consuming endeavor for us. And cloud computing. And I think Commissioner Roberts will talk a little bit about that with you. Another difference for 2013 was that we were given an appropriation of $5.2 million by the legislature to totally revamp our integrated tax software we call GenTax. So that's underway now, and that'll consume most of the next year. And we decided to split the audit and collections division into 2 divisions just because of the size of it. For management purposes. So those are some of the significant things that happened in 2013. But I want to talk a little bit more about our theme. Sense and sensibility. Some of you might have wondered what that's about. We chose this year's theme to try to describe some of the tension that we sometimes experience in our role of balancing the revenue side, the enforcement side of what we do, and the kinder, gentler, outreach and education side, where we try to help people stay in compliance with an ever more complex tax system, tax law. And as I've learned in my 5-year tenure, it can be a delicate balance. I can tell you this, today's tax commission is a very different place than it was 5 years ago. At that time, leadership's focus revolved around what was perceived as core mission. Core mission was defined as what brings in revenue. And so our resources were focused on auditing and collecting. That would be the sense part of sense and sensibility. There was little emphasis then on collaborating, communicating, outreach. Field offices, in fact, were closed and not offering public service. all with an eye toward bringing in maximum revenue. Remember the way the budget years were running in 2008 and 9 and 10. And I think it's fair to say that we were perceived as isolated or, for other reasons, secretive. Some of you may remember those years. Then about 2009 through 11, things changed a bit. We extended that focus on revenue to what we called a compliance initiative, or going after the tax gap. And this was a partnership with the governor's office and the legislature to increase our staff to get at some of the cases that we weren't working. We had lots of leads on non-filers, for instance, and it was kind of low-hanging fruit, stuff that we weren't able to deal with our current staff. And so they increased our appropriations, increased our FTE count, and that's what the tax gap compliance initiative was. And over 3 years, we brought in $52 million additional. That was, as you know, with cuts to education and other things being in the news, this was money the legislature really could use. There was a positive media perception at the time, and we heard quite a bit from taxpayers who appreciated the fact that if they're going to pay their fair share, that we would make sure that other people were as well. In 2011, just shy of about 3 years ago, we had an important leadership change. And since that time, all of the commissioners have been of the same mind, unanimous in changing the perception, that earlier perception of inaccessibility and the singular focus on raising revenue, and giving a more equal focus to the sensibility side of our mission. With the governor's approval, we embarked on an initiative to boost public confidence and increase employee pride. And if you've been attending these regularly, you've heard us talk about this before. We reopened the field offices to public service. We began collaborative management from the bottom to the top and the top to the bottom at the commission. We opened our processes to increase public involvement. We increased transparency of our policies and processes by communicating with the public and our employees. And we reached out to build relationships with policymakers, taxpayer groups, civic clubs, and county commissioners. That's the kind of thing that the commissioners and our employees have been focused on for the last 3 years. And so that's why when several legislators singled us out for criticism during the session last, and we're hitting this head on, a PR person will tell you don't ever talk about the negative, but we want to mention it in context. But it's fair to say that we were hurt by that. We were blindsided, and we knew that we had a different story to tell. And that's why when several senators came calling, as Commissioner Jackson talked about, we went and spoke with them and supported their effort and signed a letter asking for this Office of Performance Evaluation review, which, as luck would have it, was released today. We're pleased with the work that the Office of Performance Evaluation has done, and we see it as opportunity. We're glad to say we've already implemented some of its recommendations and that we will implement the others. We realize that as tax collectors, we may never be everyone's favorite state agency, but we have been striving, and we will continue to strive to find the right balance between sense and sensibility that we all need from our state revenue agency. And with that, I'll turn it over to Commissioner Roberts, who's going to talk a little bit about what we're doing going forward.
Thank you, David. Thank you for those who are attending today. We look forward to having a conversation with you, not only in this format, but also in a format to come on a panel. Well, currently, the Idaho State Tax Commission administers and processes about just shy of $3.5 billion in 20 different tax types. So today, I want to invite you to join me as we visit about why property tax software modernization is needed, why modern tax policy development and evaluation is necessary for the long-term benefit of this generation and for the future generations of the Idaho taxpayers, how the Idaho State Tax Commission has responded and continues to respond to the Office of Performance Evaluation report that was released earlier today, as Commissioner Langhorst mentioned, and the changing Idaho State Tax Commission business plan and taxpayer services, In other words, how are the procedures and processes changing to support the citizens and the businesses of the state of Idaho? And why the Idaho State Tax Commission must stay current with its modern technology and some of the risks if we do not stay current. The Commission is working towards property tax software modernization. The current property tax system is 34 years old. We'll come back to that in a moment. It's difficult to find programmers familiar with the current system's programming code, and the need for a more flexible framework for enhancements and legislative changes is important to have within our system. We'll use a web-based platform that will allow easy data sharing with other agencies. And in addition, Idaho code requires the Idaho State Tax Commission support the counties in this property tax software system. Next slide. So our current system, those of you, I hear a couple snickers already. You have to manually move around with the function keys, the F keys. A lot of those are not even on computers these days. Screens are locked, cannot be expanded or moved, and cannot pull in photographs. So, 34 years ago was in 1979. 1979. I was 16 years old back then. That was before cell phones. And just a couple of tidbits of information. In 1979, the Bee Gees had the song Tragedy. Peaches and Herb were with Reunited. Donna Summer was on the charts with Hot Stuff. And the Eagles were performing Heartache Tonight. And the Village People were performing YMCA. Most of you know that. But the number one song in 1979 was Knack with My Sharona. So that was 1979. That's the system, operating system we're still currently functioning with. So what does the new system look like? You probably take these items for granted with your computers you use today. Mouse-driven, point-click, no F key, function keys. Screens can be expanded to allow show all the data. Pop-up screens. You can add photos, and more user-friendly for the county personnel and the taxpayers. This is what the new system will look like. This will allow electronic assessment notices and tax bills to be sent to the taxpayers to avoid postage costs. The long-term cost and savings to the state of Idaho and to the counties is substantial. So here's a screenshot of what the new system might look like as compared to the old green screen with the old green letters on it. Quite a change and quite an advancement. The next thing that we're also working on, the Tax Commission working towards, is tax policy development and evaluation. What are the key components of it? To simplify Idaho tax law for taxpayers. We've heard several times today that tax law in the state of Idaho and many states is very complex and cumbersome. We're also working to, with this proposal would be to coordinate new legislation with existing laws. See what works with other existing law. A lot of times in tax policy development in the legislature, which I know a little bit about, proposals were made that was thrown to the wall, and if it stuck, it stayed. And so we have kind of a mixture of things in our tax code. So that we also want to be able to review the proposed legislation for administration. Can it be administered? Is it possible to be administered with the other laws we have? We also want to do research and tax policy options, see what other states are doing, see if there's other systems that make more sense than what is currently on our books. Evaluate how Idaho's tax structure accommodates the modern financial transactions. Does it make sense? Does it make sense in today's economy? What happened in 1931 when income tax came in? I would suspect and propose that transactions looked a little bit differently in 1931 than they do in 2013. In 1965, when House Bill 222 was passed, which was the Sales Tax Act, what did the transactions in the state of Idaho look like in 1965 compared to 2013? So, keeping current with tax structure is one of the things we're working towards for the future. I'm going to talk for a moment about the Office of Performance Evaluations and their recommendations as was released just after a couple hours ago. There's 3 recommendations that they propose. One is to develop a comprehensive taxpayer rights publication, and that involves like brochures, how tax things are treated for different situations for taxpayers. We are currently in the process of reevaluating those publications. Number 2, develop a web page dedicated to taxpayer rights. Those of you that might be listening online currently as we're speaking, if you go to the home page on the right-hand side, active today is the Taxpayer Bill of Rights and some newly updated brochures on that. Number 3, improve data management to help guide the agency decisions. David talked a little bit about this. We've just recently hired research analysts to analyze and compile data for the agency decision making. We welcome this independent review, and we are responding to and will continue to do so. The older laws that we have, and I know David mentioned that I would talk about this, about the cloud computing. Some of the older laws that we have are clashing with newer business transactions, which result in frustration for all of us, both at the Commission and those business owners who are trying to conduct business. And i.e., for example, cloud computing is one of those issues. So trying to stay proactive, the Idaho State Tax Commission business plans are things that we're working on. Providing educational materials to new businesses will hopefully provide them with an opportunity to obtain education about tax obligations and to ask questions that will prevent future audits or collection issues. The Tax Commission occasionally identifies compliance issues, which additional information would help the entire industry or group. In those situations, the Commission has started to develop guidance papers to enhance the understanding of the law or give suggestions on how to improve compliance with the law. Our first such paper covers the proper calculation of bad debt adjustments for the automobile industry. We've since done some other publications on vacation rentals and on elk farms of all things. The Idaho State Tax Commission is working to review all of our topics, specific brochures to ensure that they are current and relevant. Our focus on making sure the information can be easily understood and available when needed. Our compliance staff focuses on ensuring that the laws and rules are properly applied, and we are working on improving our service and responsiveness to all the citizens and businesses that we serve. Taxpayer online services. You've heard a lot about Gentax 9. It's the operating system that we use for our software. In an effort to build bridges with taxpayers, an upgraded version will be provided, granting citizens access to their own accounts through an email services or taxpayer access point, or TAP, which is very similar to what you might do today in your online banking, and those services are provided by the banking industry. New application software provides secure access from any device, anywhere, at any time. Expanding the current TAP capabilities allows the taxpayers to check refund statuses, initiate payment agreements, change addresses, cancel accounts, view and verify account information, and payment filing history. Businesses will be able to more easily manage their electronic filings and payments. There is also increased protection for fraud and identity theft prevention. So staying current with technology is another thing I wanted to talk about, what we're doing in the future. It's a must, and it is very expensive. The cost of complexity, the technology that is beyond our control changes very quickly. In other words, what's happening in the world today in the technology, we must stay up and current with that. The cost of the personnel to recruit those individuals and to retain them are very difficult in the IT world today because of the high demand. Cost of security, hacking gets more sophisticated every day. Speaking of hacking and fraud, let's go to the next slide. Just a few stats. I know we weren't going to talk about stats today, but I have to get at least a couple in. Fraudulent returns identified. This ought to be a concern to you. In 2011, you'll see we had 183 fraudulent returns detected or identified. That number grew this year so far to 563 returns. For a revenue that we stopped going out the door in an incorrect way was just shy of $600,000. Interestingly, of those, the grocery tax credit fraud was 130 of those cases, which as the amount of the grocery tax credit increased, more and more people are deciding that they want to fraudulently file a return to get that credit. And that number in 2011 for grocery tax was, 2010 was 2 cases. And then in 2011 it grew to 9 and currently stands at 130. While we're on this subject of fraud, we will turn up the heat on the fraudulent tax filers. Zero tolerance, and it should be, for those stealing dollars from the citizenry of the state of Idaho. So in conclusion, what to remember? 34-year-old property tax software needs to be updated. Remember the village, people. I can't do the YMCA thing very well in a suit, but modernizing tax policy is necessary to meet the future needs of this state and to our next generation. Idaho's Tax Commission has met or is in the process of meeting the Office of Performance Evaluation's recommendations. State Tax Commission is continuing to improve taxpayer services. And finally, the Tax Commission must stay current with modern technology to stay ahead of the modern criminal. So sense and sensibility. I hope you understand that we as commissioners take our jobs very, very seriously. And we use a lot of common sense to administer the revenue collection system for the state of Idaho and to its citizens. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce Mike Chakaran, who is going to give us an update on the legislative proposals. Mike?
Thank you, Commissioner Roberts. It's my pleasure to stand here today and talk to you about our legislative proposals for 2014 and also talk about our negotiated rulemaking process. On the legislative arena, each year the Tax Commission has the responsibility to send down to the Governor's office changes to the tax code or proposed changes to the tax code that remedy injustice, correct irregularities, and also improve tax collections efficiency and make sure we collect taxes in an economically efficient manner. And we have 14 proposals that we'll offer this year. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to touch on a couple of the highlights. So if you want to flip to the next slide. Thank you. Our first bill that we like to introduce every year is our annual conformity bill. And this is an important bill that basically trues up or synchronizes the Idaho tax code to the federal tax code as of 1/1/2014. And this is important because it sets the starting point for how we calculate Idaho taxable income. Our second bill, another important bill, is we want to modify how the tax treatment for companies that do business in multiple states. And the tax code in this area has been rather, it's not kept up with modern business practices. And we want to start working on modifying that. In the property tax area, we have 2 proposals that I wanted to touch on. One of them relates to the House bill that passed this last session regarding the personal property tax exemption. And there's a method in the bill about how the levy rates are calculated. And the formula got disjointed. And so we are proposing a change to that, because if it doesn't happen, what's going to result is that any taxing district that has property taxes as its funding source will not receive the full value of their budget, so they're going to be underfunded. And then we have another proposal regarding the assessment methodology for operating property of rate-regulated public utilities. The methodology that's been used over the years has been a source of controversy between the Tax Commission and the utilities, and now we think we've got a mechanism worked out to hopefully remedy that problem and get away from a constant source of litigation. So if you would switch to the next one. You're probably wondering, I'm talking about legislation, and you see a pile of paper stacked up from floor to ceiling. This was one return that we received this past October. It's probably a partnership return. And so what we would like to do is get rid of that paper. And we're going to ask this year that the legislature give us the authority to require paid tax return preparers to submit their tax returns that they prepare for their clients and use electronic filing to do that. We're also going to ask that large corporations and large partnerships also file their tax returns electronically. That's not the only 20,000-page return we receive manually. We get several of those or more a year, and it takes about a day and a half to run those through our imaging system to get into our tax program. So let's jump now to what we call negotiated rulemaking. And this gets to the Commissioner Langhorst and Roberts' remarks about openness and transparency. The traditional rulemaking process was pretty simple. The agency could propose a rule, publish it in the bulletin. There would be a 21-day comment period. Then the commission would decide whether or not to approve the rule or reject the rule or modify the rule. And then it would, if it was approved, it would go on to the legislature. And the thinking is that that's probably not the most efficient way to do a lot of rules. Maybe it would be better if we drew back and got the public involved in the rulemaking process earlier in the process. And there's a number of reasons to do this. One, hopefully we'll get a better rule out of it. Two, it'll expedite that formal rulemaking process because now we can work out all the bugs and the glitches and the kinks in the proposed rule without that crunch of that 21-day period probably that's going to happen in the late fall so that we can get the paperwork done to get it off to the governor's office. So let's negotiate rulemaking. The agency has the, we have to consider it, but it's not required that we do it. But with our commissioners, they are very encouraging us to negotiate rules whenever they can. And there's some rules that it just doesn't make sense. So we do some administrative rules where we're just changing an interest rate to reflect what the new interest rates ought to be for a coming year. There's no point in trying to negotiate that type of a rule. So let's walk through how the agency is going to do this. From a very high level. All right, step one. Commission staff is going to look at a rule and say, yep, it ought to be negotiated. And steps two, basically, is we have some paperwork to get done. We're going to have to publish a notice of intent to promulgate a rule using negotiated rulemaking. So that a notice will go out to the taxpayers, and what's going to be contained in that notice is a summary of what the rule is all about, hopefully in plain English, and what the rule is supposed to accomplish. It's also going to describe how the public can participate in the process. And typically, we're going to have a series of open meetings that interested parties can either attend in person or attend via conference call. And if you want to attend by a conference call, it's on our dime. It's a toll-free number that you can call in on. And we're also going to solicit oral remarks at those meetings, written comments at those meetings, or if you don't feel like you want to participate in that matter, you can send us comments, email or in letter form or however, whatever makes you more comfortable. Then also that notice will tell if we've decided to hold, in other words, what the schedule will be of open meetings, if we know at the time. And step three, the Rules Committee will sit down. They may have a draft rule to discuss, and they're going to share that with the stakeholders. And then they'll get that dialogue going about what if it's the content of the rule hitting the right spots. Is it covering all the bases? Does it make sense? And we'll get that feedback from the public, either the oral comments or the written comments, and then there may be another Rules Committee meeting after staff has had a chance to evaluate the comments. They may make a modification to the rule, they may not. It all depends. So this process could go over the course of a summer. There could be multiple meetings on a rule depending on the complexity of the rule. And then at some point in time, staff is going to decide that the rule is about as ready as it can get, and then we're going to enter the next step, which is kind of getting into the formal rulemaking process. This will be taking you into step 4. So there's some paperwork to do. We've got to get another notice out to the public. And now the draft rule becomes a proposed rule. And now this is when the formal 21-day comment period will begin. We'll get the formal comments from taxpayers. And if enough people request, then we'll hold a formal hearing at the Tax Commission. And then ultimately, The committee may decide to modify a rule or drop the rule, for that matter. And then ultimately, the commissioners have to evaluate the rule at another open meeting, and then they'll decide whether or not to proceed with the rule. And then it becomes another part of the process, and that becomes a pending rule, and then that will go to the legislature for their evaluation in the next session. So how can you participate in the rule process? How are you going to keep track of all this stuff? So here we go. We've got a revamped website. So you probably know this, but I'll just reinforce it anyway. tax.idaho.gov is our website. And if you're interested in the rules, you want to go up here and click on the governance, and then drop down to negotiated rulemaking. And then that will open up another page here for rules. And then it'll list the different committees that are involved in the rulemaking, like in this case, income tax. Switch to the next slide. Then when you click on that, you'll notice that each rule will have its own page, or each tax type will have its own page, and it'll list out all the rules that the committee's working on. So if you'll click on, let's say, that rule, it will open up another page that gives a lot of detail about what's transpired with that rule. It'll go through the status of the rulemaking, how to participate, what the meetings are and when they're going to be held, how many, if there's drafts being circulated, what the public comments are so far, and any other supporting documents. So that's our process in a nutshell, and it's my turn to turn it over to Commissioner Tom Cassiamides for some remarks before we go on a break.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We appreciate it. Good information, and thank you, David. Thank you, Ken. It was terrific information. It gave us a good insight into where we've been and where we're heading, and I think it was very helpful. I did want to recognize one other individual out here who just showed up, Senator Bob Geddes, our former chairman, and the guy that was kind of our guiding light for a year and a half or so there, and really gave us a lot of help with the Tax Commission. We appreciate you being here, Bob. I know you're off making the big bucks now, but it was great to see you. Always terrific. We're going to take about a 10-minute break here in just a second, and we'll follow that with a panel discussion. And Jim Weatherby has been kind enough to moderate that panel discussion, and he'll introduce all the panel members. We're taking written questions from the audience. We'll bring them up, present them to Jim, and he'll read them to the panel and try to have them answered. And again, the viewers that are viewing this online can go ahead through taxidaho.gov and pick that up and actually type or email a question in to this meeting right now, our meeting, and we will have that on card form also that will be presented to Jim. So if anybody wants to do that, they're certainly welcome to interactively video or bring that up through the website we have. At this time, let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back at about 5 till or 4, right at 4, and we'll have our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Legislature Live, Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee Channel. Idaho in Session, sponsored by Idaho State Broadcasters Association, the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation, Union Pacific Foundation, Idaho Association of Counties, Idaho Telecommunications Association of Idaho Cities, and your contributions to Idaho Public Television Endowment. Idaho Legislature Live, Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee Channel. Idaho in Session, sponsored by Idaho State Broadcasters Association, the J.A. and Catherine Albertson Foundation, Union Pacific Foundation, Idaho Association, Idaho Cable Telecommunications Association, Association of Idaho Cities, and your contributions to Idaho Public Television Endowment.
Jim's a good moderator. Okay, thank you very much. Let's get started again. And it's I did miss a couple things. Senator Vick is out here in the audience also, and I wanted to recognize him. Thank you for coming to our meeting. And I neglected to thank the Idaho Association of CPAs, the society, providing all the refreshments, all these great cookies. And I brought a couple back here just so I could remind myself, because I'll eat them while I'm sitting here. But we appreciate them providing all the cookies and information. I got things we had for the break. At this time, I want to introduce Jim Weatherby. And Jim Weatherby has moderated many different panels throughout the state, does an excellent job, and I want to start him off now, and he can introduce the panel and then go ahead with the questions that we hope we get. So, Jim?
Thank you, Commissioner. Welcome to our panel discussion on tax policy and administration with 2 legislators, a practitioner, and 3 tax commissioners. And we have less than an hour to cover all kinds of questions. I will pose a few questions. I will ask you if you have questions. Please write them down, raise your hand, and they will be picked up, and that's why your moderator is sitting on the end, so I can take those, as well as those listening to us by the internet. At this point, I'd like to introduce each member of the panel. Please hold your applause until I've introduced everybody. Representative Grant Burgoyne is from District 16 in Ada County. He is an attorney and former chair of the Ada County Democratic Party. He's the Assistant House Minority Leader, a member of the Revenue and Taxation, Judiciary, and Ways and Means Committees. Senator Jim Rice represents District 10 in Canyon County. Even though he's in his first term as a state senator, he is vice chair of the Senate Local Government and Taxation Committee. Senator Rice serves on the Agricultural Affairs and Transportation Committee. Tanya Nyman is a CPA with more than 12 years in the accounting industry. She has a Master of Science in Accounting and Taxation from Boise State University. Ms. Nyman is an active member of the Idaho Society of Certified Public Accountants and participant in the Tax Commission's negotiated rulemaking process. Tom Katzlamides, appointed to the Tax Commission in 1895.
Getting started.
In 2005, I forgot he has a microphone too. After serving 18 years as a Bannock County Commissioner. Throughout his tenure with the Tax Commission, his major area of responsibility has been the agency's property tax division and administration of property taxes throughout Idaho. Commissioner Katzlamides also oversees fuels and tobacco taxes, and as if working for the Tax Commission isn't enough, he also wears another hat, serving as Idaho's athletic commissioner. David Langhorst was appointed to the Tax Commission in 2009 and has served as interim chair. Before becoming a tax commissioner, he served in both houses of the Idaho legislature, where he specialized in tax policy. His major areas of oversight include individual income tax and the new collections division, which was formerly part of the audit division. Ken Roberts was appointed to the Tax Commission in 2012. He's a third-generation Valley County farmer who resigned during his 6th term in a leadership position in the Idaho House to become a commissioner. Commissioner Roberts oversees sales and related taxes, tax policy, and the audit and tax processing divisions of the agency. At this point, clapping is in order, or applause. My first question goes to our 2 legislators, and I'll begin with you, Senator Rice. Would you tell us how you perceive the role of the Tax Commission?
Well, the Tax Commission has the critical role of collecting the taxes. Without taxes, there's nothing to spend, which means no roads, no schools, no government functions. It's kind of one of those interesting things, and throughout history, tax commissions or tax collectors have been the most reviled portion of the government. And when you do a really good job and you treat taxpayers really well, about the best you're going to get is treated as necessary. You're never going to be the favorite. And so, but it is a critical function. It's absolutely essential, and it's also essential that the Tax Commission interpret the code or the statutes in the way that the legislature intends, which sometimes can require a crystal ball.
Representative Burgoyne, the role of the Commission.
Well, I have a great deal of empathy for the Commission. Senator Rice and I are both lawyers, and I think as lawyers we understand what the Commission goes through. Sometimes people in our roles aren't the most popular because we bring the bad news. But I think we have to remember that the Tax Commission doesn't make the tax policy of the state of Idaho. We in the legislature do that. And so when you pick up the newspaper and you see something that is critical of tax policy, it's natural for people to blame the Commission because they're the ones collecting the tax. But we're the ones that have either put that policy in place or have allowed that policy to remain in place. And so the role is that the Commission, in some respects, does the legislature's dirty work. They go out and they enforce the tax laws as they are written. That's what we expect. We don't expect them to enforce the tax laws in some fashion that they're not written. There may be more sensible policies that could be followed. There may be more sensible laws that could be enacted, but the Commission is stuck with the laws that are there, and they're stuck with the rules that are there that are approved by the legislature.
We'll continue with you, Representative Burgoyne. What steps can the Tax Commission do to improve its services to the public and to the legislature?
Well, you know, whenever we have problems with state government, there can be a lot of reasons why we have problems in state government. But usually at the bottom of whatever I've looked into is we have a resources problem. We don't have enough money to do the job the way the people in the agencies, the people in the legislature, probably the people in the governor's office like to see the job done. An example is what was talked about earlier in this session, a 1979 property tax program. Why haven't we updated that? It's, I assume, not going to be easy for the Commission to find the funds to do that. Obviously, it's past time. Those are the kinds of things, keeping government modern, making sure that people who are out in the private sector and have modern processes can deal seamlessly and easily with the Tax Commission's processes. That's true all across state government. We need to continually do a better job of making sure that our computer processes and our human processes are in sync with what's going on in the private sector.
Senator Rice?
I think that one of the biggest challenges, but also the thing that's of most use, is that in developing procedures, we need them to be as direct, as easy to understand as possible, because we have the full spectrum of society in the state of Idaho that need to understand what to do on their taxes. And that requires a lot of working back and forth and working together with the legislature. When something is clear as mud, we need to know, because that's the only way we can fix it and maybe clear up the mud out of the water so that people can understand it. Because if what we pass is unintelligible to you, it's definitely unintelligible to the taxpayers, and probably some multiple of how unintelligible it is to you. And so we need that feedback, and sometimes the simplest solution isn't necessarily to make the rule that would just implement. Sometimes you need to let us know that maybe we need a statute that says you don't need to do a particular thing to get a particular exemption or something like that. So that feedback and trying to make things as clear and understandable as possible are the things that need to be done.
Now we'll move to Tanya Nyman. Ms. Nyman, speaking for the practitioners, how do you perceive the role of the Idaho Tax Commission?
Well, like Representative Burgoyne said about attorneys, CPAs can also empathize in the deliverance of bad news. We regularly need to provide our clients with, here's your tax bill, and then, oh, by the way, here's our invoice as well. So that can be tricky. But that being said, as accountants, as CPAs working with the public, we also are kind of in a unique position because we are partnering with the clients, but we're also partnering with the tax commission in trying to help calculate the tax and get a fair and timely result for them. We also rely on the tax commission to be an educational resource for us as we're trying to interpret the new laws that have come in and the legislative actions that have taken place, and that's why opportunities such as the negotiated rulemaking process are important, because we can actively work with them in that partnership.
Any thoughts about how the commission can improve its services to practitioners?
One idea that I have heard bounced around at various meetings with other practitioners is that there is a desire for some kind of a practitioner's hotline. There's one with the IRS where we can call in and be able to talk to somebody that perhaps has a little more knowledge on an elevated issue. We're not looking for a real basic answer for something, but if there was a practitioner's hotline, that would be something that would really be useful. And as they were talking about the Gen Tax upgrade, I don't know if that's going to have provision in there where the practitioners can access it, similar to the e-services product that the IRS has, where we can get on there and help a client interpret the information that's on there and take a look at what documents the state has received. But if there was something like that, that would be tremendously useful for us.
Thank you. We'll move to the commissioners. A general question and we'll begin with you, Commissioner Katsoulides. What challenges does the Tax Commission face in dealing with the public and the legislature?
Well, thank you, Jim. We've got several, and the area I, of course, am involved with primarily is property taxes, and we don't just deal with the some of the public from time to time. We deal with 44 counties and almost all the elected officials in all those counties, and good to see you all here. It's nice to have a lot of the elected officials from the counties here and be able to participate. But we work, and Steve Fiskus out here does most of the heavy lifting in that area for the Tax Commission, and he does a great job in dealing with all those elected officials. I think the only one he doesn't have to work with is the coroner for the most part, but that may be coming up. But we do deal with all those folks, and a lot of the complaints that they bring forward from those constituents and taxing districts. You know, there are over 1,200 taxing districts in the state of Idaho, and the property tax end of things deals with each of those taxing districts and all the intricacies and overlaps and urban renewal areas that they're involved with. So we deal with a lot of different people day to day in the property tax division.
Okay. Commissioner Langhorse?
The question challenges that we face.
Challenges dealing with the public and the legislators.
Okay. One of the real common ones is just the complexity of the tax code, and it gets worse every year. And trying to translate that for folks. Another one is, and I don't want to overstate this, but, you know, to the extent that we have some tax protesters that we deal with, anti-government, anti-tax sentiment is probably greater now than I remember seeing it in previous years, so that kind of fuels, you know, that part of what we do. Resources, of course, are always an issue in a state agency, and you know, we have options. We can always de-emphasize or deprioritize certain things, so you can always pick how you're going to spend your resources, but we often face, I think it's an understatement, in fact, to say that we don't have enough resources to do everything that everybody wants us to do, the legislature and the public included.
Commissioner Roberts?
I think there's a couple areas dealing with the public. I think one of the things that we are challenged with is nobody really likes taxes, not even any of us sitting up here on the panel. We try to pay legally as small amount of tax bill as we can. And so getting people's attention on their obligation and the information for the laws, the tax laws, is a challenge for us. So I think communication with the public, and that's where we're trying to be creative of how we reach out to the taxpayer public, because methods of communication today have changed substantially. If you ask the young 20-year-old who has a new job, they virtually live by everything that comes on a smartphone or an iPad, and so that's ways we have to communicate. There are expectations, I think, on some issues. We have some problematic areas that are always controversial, whether they're double claim dependents on a tax return. Husband and wife get a divorce, they both claim the child. Well, you can't do that. And so we forever have a stream of those that come through. So communicating some of those issues are problematic for us. I think with the legislators, communication, I think I'm really glad to hear the two legislators talk about that the legislature does make the policy. And I like the comment that we like to have it direct and easy to follow. And we'll let you know when they're not that way, because there are some of them. And it's easy to take a concept idea as a legislator. From past experience, I know this, and I'll say this again, but I wished I would have known then what I know now as a legislator. It's easy to take an overall concept and say, I want to pass this legislation and change public policy. Well, without thoroughly vetting it through the system and saying, how does it interact with existing law, especially in the tax area?
Question for both Commissioners Roberts and Langhorse. As former legislators, how has your view changed of the Tax Commission? You referenced it a bit, Commissioner Roberts. Go ahead and pursue that thought further.
I think that there's dynamics of being an administrator in a branch of government on the executive side, such as managing a budget, such as personnel issues, such as compensation issues, the day-to-day management, which we do as commissioners. That's kind of rare in some states. We are unique in that we are very hands-on. And so I think understanding the balance between managing a budget, implementing the tax laws, and also sitting as a person who has to make decisions on appeal cases. You know, is the tax due? Is there a financial hardship? Did we follow the law? Is the law balanced? Do our rules reflect the law? I think are things that have really opened my eyes as to how to administer the tax policy of the state.
Okay. Commissioner Langworth?
Probably, I don't know that my understanding of the commission changed that much, but of the employees there, it definitely did. The things that we ask people to do with our laws, and how I've gone out in the field with some of our collection folks, and it's eye-opening when you see the look on someone's face when you're going to take their car away. And that is what our tax law requires us to do. It requires us to put liens on people's property if they don't pay their liabilities. Sometimes harsh measures. And so I've really learned to respect, what we ask them to do and how hard they work. That's one of the things. Another interesting thing, I thought that I understood how when you get into the real sophisticated tax types, corporate and multi-state, the game of litigation and of tax planning and of just ways to work the system, which I do not fault anybody for. This is just a function of the tax code and the way things work. I'm not disparaging when I say this, but it makes me, I would have never said this before I became a commissioner and when I was a legislator, but it makes me wonder about the efficacy, the overall efficacy of corporate taxation and whether it's efficient or not.
One follow-up question for the commissioners. What would you want the public to know of the tax commission, the identity, or what message do you want to project?
I'm going to jump right in. We have 450, well, about 430 employees now, because that's just, we have vacancies all the time. But I guess I would like the public to know that all of the taxpayer or tax commission employees are taxpayers again themselves. They have families. They know what it is to make ends meet. Some of them work 2 or 3 jobs, and they can identify with the situation that a lot of Idaho people are in, because they are Idaho citizens. And I think that's one message I would proclaim loud and clear. I think the other thing about the tax commission is it's a job. When I first got appointed to the job, I would go to church on Sunday, and boy, I get really harassed that, oh, you're the tax collector now. But somebody has to do the job. It's not the most, and I wrote this down, it's never the favorite and have to do the dirty work, as I think I'm quoting correctly. But I think in the same time you can be sensitive, and I want people to know that we are sensitive to their circumstances.
Commissioner Langhorst?
One of the things I love telling people is how much more fun and interesting this job is than I anticipated. So that's one thing that I think surprises people. I would want them to know, I would love for the public to really just appreciate the fact that what we do is keep the playing field level for all of you, the majority of people out there that pay their taxes on time, voluntarily, which is what our system is set up to do. And so we're here for them. And finally, something that Senator Rice said very well, and which we say to our employees a lot, is reminding them that they're the ones that make this function of government work and allow for the legislature to have that money to appropriate so that we have schools, roads, public safety, and so forth.
Okay. Thank you. A question from our audience, and we can take more, or I can just hold these up and start making up the questions. And that sometimes can be dangerous. This first question relates to internet sales tax. Voluntary compliance is key for Idaho's tax system. Line 7 on the Idaho form is where individuals report their use tax. Very few taxpayers report any use tax. What is it? 9,600 of us law-abiding citizens report that use tax. In short, noncompliance is very high, probably over 90%. It's what, 98% or more than that. This is detrimental to Idaho's, I didn't write this question, by the way, it did come from the audience. This is detrimental to Idaho's tax system. Use tax compliance could be greatly increased by exempting the first $4,000 of online purchases from a use tax. Would you be supportive? Comments, reactions. Begin with the legislators. Representative Burgoyne?
Well, I might be supportive. It doesn't make sense to have laws that you either can't practically enforce or there will not be a high level of voluntary compliance. I mean, the fact is on these internet sales, you get down to the end of the year and you start thinking about all your tax issues. It's not one that pops up in the minds of most people. We're just kind of conditioned from the time that we're little kids, and I'll date myself here. I'm a little older than Commissioner Roberts. Things like YMCA are somehow seeping through my Alzheimer's. But I remember I'd get a quarter, and I'd remember that a quarter didn't go as far as I thought it was as soon as I took my first quarter to the store because there was sales tax. And so we're kind of conditioned that the sales tax is something you pay when you buy. And so I don't think people are willfully avoiding the law so much as it's just in the scheme of our lives, it's not something they think about at the end of the year. And so to have some exemption may make some sense, but the thing that I prefer is that we get serious in Idaho about enforcing our sales tax law. We have the ability to do that through the streamlined sales tax. And I don't know if this will be the year or not. It may not be. But I think we have to remember that simply to enforce our tax laws is not a tax increase. To enforce our tax laws means that we're actually going to be sure that everybody is being treated the same. And when we turn a blind eye to something like the internet sales tax, what we're really doing is allowing some people to get an advantage over other people, whether they intend to do that or not. And that's not right, it's not fair. And so I think we need to get serious on this issue. And the House Rev and Tax Committee has looked at this issue a number of times, and it's come close a couple of times to getting out of committee, but we haven't quite gotten there. And I think it's something that we need to look at now that we have a really very different House Revenue and Taxation Committee.
Okay. Senator Rice?
You know, this is, I agree with what Representative Burgoyne said about why people don't get that on their returns. It's not something people think about, and they don't keep records that closely of what they buy. And it's bad policy to have something on there that we say, okay, you're supposed to pay this tax, that isn't going to be enforceable. It's not going to be complied with, more because people aren't even going to remember than because of anything else. As far as internet sales tax, there's a number of problems with that. First, I agree, it's not a tax increase. It's a tax that should be paid. It's a collection methodology problem. Streamlined sales tax is still something of a voluntary system as far as the collection goes by the companies that are selling on the internet, and we actually need some legislation at the federal level. I mean, there's little inroads we can make. It's not a complete solution, and we really need a complete solution, but that's going to require action by the U.S. Congress, and they're not doing it right now.
Commissioner Katsilometes?
Well, you know, I think Senator Rice hit it on the nail head there. It's what he said, and I do think that it's a little bit of unfair situation that it's voluntary, and it does have a complex amount of national elements that have to be put into place to make this work. That means they have to have a national law. And then we have to have a state law to make it work. But we do need this. I think the bottom line to a lot of the, and this is my personal opinion, from a tax commission standpoint, we're going to do just what the legislature tells us to do. We're not gonna set law and make policy. But from a personal standpoint, I do think it really does hurt the mom and pop businesses that are along Main Street, and you see some of these businesses dried up, and I think that's a result of some of the internet sales, in my estimation. But that's just from a personal viewpoint.
Any other comments, panel? Commissioner Roberts?
You know, this is kind of in my oversight area, and I've actually been attending for the last 18 months the streamlined sales and use tax meetings throughout the country. Just a little bit of an advertisement. Tomorrow morning at a little after 8 o'clock at the Associated Taxpayers of Idaho meeting, Senator Wayne Harper from Utah is going to be speaking. He is also currently the chairman of the governing board for sales and use tax on internet. There are 24 states that currently belong to a voluntary system, which would open the door for about 2,300 retailers throughout the country who would voluntarily send in sales and use tax to member states. In Idaho, that would equate to somewhere between $2.5 to $4 million a year that would come in the door for us simply joining the agreement, which the dues for us is about $20,000 a year. So, but remember that tax is due and payable. It's a current tax that's on the books today, and it's paid by Idaho citizens, though. And so those are some of the dynamics of it. Currently, if a retailer has physical presence in the state of Idaho, in other words, a catalog company has a store in Idaho, because of the Quill decision, they are required to collect and send in and submit use tax to the state of Idaho. But I think the main point here, and I used to be one of those legislators that was opposed to it at one point in time, and then I changed my position probably 4 or 5 years ago, because it's a different type of transaction than we've had historically in this country. If you look, we're just approaching the Christmas season, and I can't imagine how many .com businesses are doing great business today because of internet sales, and how many people are putting packages under the tree this year that technically owe the use tax but may or may not pay it. And so it's something I think we need to do to stay current, so that the playing field is equitable for both small businesses, the moms and pop stores here in Idaho. They're operating at a disadvantage, and eventually they'll be put out of business because they're at a 6% disadvantage.
Any other comments, Commissioner Langhorst?
Just very quick, I was wondering about the premise of that question and the idea that a $4,000 exemption would increase compliance. And then I thought, you know, if you really want 100% compliance, just lower the rate to 0 and everybody's compliant. And that reminded me of this balance that I talked about today, that our theme, you know, sense and sensibility. Compliance is important, but it's not everything. We're still a revenue agency.
Ms. Nyman, do you want to weigh in on this whole area?
I think a lot of it's already been said, but I would agree, first of all, with the initial comments that the problem is that, as was mentioned, people are used to paying the sales tax at the point of sale, and to pay it after the fact is difficult. But it's also difficult to, like, when you ask your clients, did you purchase anything online that was not already subjected to sales tax? Because if they ordered from Macy's or they ordered from anywhere that has a physical presence store, as was mentioned by the commissioner, they are paying sales tax on that. And so to get them to give you a printout of everything they've purchased online for the year and then try to figure out which ones were subjected and which ones weren't, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. So I just wanted to reiterate what they had already said, and from the practitioner's point of we want the tax returns correct, but at what cost of compliance, at what cost to the taxpayer in the hours for what may not be anything if they've just ordered from the JCPenney's and the Macy's and the Amazons that have already collected that sales tax and remitted it.
Okay, thank you. Next question is to you, Commissioner Langhorst. Would Commissioner Langhorst expand on his comment regarding the efficiency of corporate income tax?
Yes, and I'm not the only one that holds this question. It's intriguing to me, but it speaks to the idea that corporate taxation has become so muddled and confused when you've got corporations that have operations in so many different states, and how do you determine how much income goes to each state and so forth. On top of that, the incentive that is there for tax planning and employing CPAs and lawyers to figure out ways, and it's worth the investment to save on their tax bill. And by the time that happens, and by the time audit functions, you know, sometimes multi-years of auditing occurs, and then the fights happen in the courts. Some people are theorizing, and I'm open to this, like I used to not be, that there's probably a more efficient way to tax corporations than corporate income tax. I hope that answers the question.
Representative Burgoyne.
Thank you. You know, I think there are a couple of things to think about when we talk about this issue about corporate income tax. And I happen to share former Senator Langhorst and Commissioner Langhorst's views on this. I have a lot of questions about the corporate income tax as well, and here's why. One of the things that concerns me is with tax policy, at what level in the economy, in any given set of transactions, does it make sense as a practical matter to tax for whatever reason we're going to tax? Now, there are a couple of reasons that people believe there should be taxes on things. They want to raise revenue or they want to motivate behavior. Now, at the state level, I happen to think that raising revenue is the primary concern and motivating behavior is an entirely secondary issue and maybe not legitimate at all. But certainly those are historically two things that really matter, motivating behavior and raising revenue. And so trying to get a picture of the economy, if I was to go back to school and get a PhD in economics and had another 40 or 50 years of life to devote to this, we might be able to figure out, where it truly makes sense to start taxing transactions. But I think we know enough to know this, that you can create a maladaptive system that disincentivizes economic activity if you're taxing transactions in the wrong places. And so I think that given everything that Commissioner Langhorst has said, plus all of the things that we already know about the corporate income tax, this is an area we really need to be thinking about whether it makes any sense to do. Is this the right place? The European model is you tax a lot at the point of sale, these VAT taxes. There's talk of a national sales tax. Does that make sense? Does an income tax make more sense or not? Getting this mix right is very complicated. It depends on the economy you're in. What's the right answer today may not be the right answer in 25 years.
Senator Rice?
It goes back to this simple, direct, easy to understand. Taxes are also best if they're the easiest to administer. One of the challenges with taxation is everybody wants somebody else to pay the taxes. And that's because they're looking only at who writes the check for the taxes and thinks that they're the one paying the taxes. But economies redistribute taxes by changing prices, wages, and opportunity. And so taxation should always be aimed where it redistributes along those lines the least. And that's one of the reasons why you've seen a shift in Europe to point of sale type taxes, is because they shift the least in the economy. And as a result, people have more opportunity, you have less trouble collecting the tax. But it's one of those really interesting dynamics because you still have a lot of people that want somebody else to pay the tax, even when the secondary result of shifting it, who writes the check, destroys opportunity for the people that think they're not paying the tax.
Any other comments? Next question. When a negotiated rule is to be voted on by the Rules Committee, should the public have a vote?
I'll take that one. No. And here's why I say no. Define the public. Who decides who's going to sit on the Rules Committee and vote on that, and who doesn't get to? The public has input in our process now. They have input at the level where the commissioners decide to send it, and they have input at the legislature with their elected officials. So that, to me, is the way that it should work. I can't imagine how you would ever decide who gets to vote.
Senator Rice?
You know, one of the great things about Idaho is that every rule comes back to the legislature. And it can be rejected by the legislature or accepted by the legislature. And every citizen of the state of Idaho who's of age to vote can vote for their representatives and senators who are going to make that decision. And so they're actually represented in the rulemaking process. The important thing about negotiated rulemaking is that we hear the ideas and the problems, because none of us are capable of recognizing all of the problems with ideas that we might have. And so it's important that we have good, robust discussions.
Ms. Nyman?
Yes, I just wanted to respond to that a little bit also, because something that I have found that people don't understand is that the negotiated rulemaking process, they have the idea that they're making rules that are new legislative changes, and I just wanted to emphasize that that process is developing rules that interpret the laws that have been passed. So it's not new laws, it's just interpreting how those laws that have been passed are going to be administered, and trying to spell it out maybe with additional examples or additional information, the existing legislative actions, and then those rules go back to the legislature for approval to say, yes, this is what we meant. So I wasn't sure that was clear.
Commissioner Roberts?
I think it's interesting to take a little bit of a study of what other states do when it comes to to rulemaking. Most states do not have I'm going to use this in quotations, negotiated rulemaking process. It's typically up to the agency. In fact, in a lot of states, they do not even have the approval process for the legislature. The legislature doesn't have that ability to reject rules. In Idaho, it's a little unique based off of some court cases in the history that got us to this point where both bodies have to affirmatively reject a rule if they don't agree with it. I think the label for negotiated rulemaking is probably inappropriately placed and should probably say something like transparent and input related rulemaking, because what the intent is to not do it behind closed doors, so that the light shines on the process, and also when the industry is involved with it or taxpayer group, that they have input into the rule. Say, for instance, whether it's a DEQ rule or an agricultural rule, that an industry can say, well, this proposed rule is going to affect us, adversely. Then they have input into it, so that it's not done without a balance. And so I think one of the things I saw happen this year is in negotiating rulemaking setting, we actually got to the point where it was like, okay, we're all going to vote now, and it's like this big committee hearing again. And we said, no, wait a minute. That process played out in January through April in this building in the legislature, and that's where that policy should be set, not within a rulemaking process. So I think it's important that it's open to the public. The light is being shown on it, and we want input. But to take that to a level and try to dictate policy within the rules through the public process is not what rulemaking is about.
Commissioner Katzelmedes?
Real quickly, we do want public input, but I think Alan Dornfest runs his policy division, and that's really the footprint that we've been using at the Tax Commission in terms of negotiated rulemaking. And that really has representatives from all sectors, business and elected officials, and the public has that input into the elected officials. His meetings are open to the public, they're open meetings, and they really work well. But that's where you have that, as far as I can see, that public input is right with the elected officials that are sitting in his negotiated rule meetings.
In fact, you're running this meeting, aren't you, Commissioner Katzelmedes? Do we have any more time, or?
Who's the?
10 till 5.
10, we have some more time.
Oh, do we have
if you
some more?
want it, and if the panel can stand it.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure we're not going overtime. Any comments? We're at a bit of a disadvantage here in that the Office of Performance Evaluation report was done just before this meeting, so it's hard to talk much about it. Any comments about that report other than you've already reported?
Okay. Probably not more than what we already covered, but it's worth repeating that we were a party to this. We joined with the senators in asking OPE for this evaluation, and we saw the potential for us to learn some things that we might not be able to see ourselves. And having now absorbed it, we got an advance copy, but it did just come out hours ago. We find opportunity in here, good suggestions, and we have pretty much at this point pledged to follow every recommendation.
The report, as I understand it, and I may be wrong, I doubt it, but I might be wrong, that there was in the report a difference in perception between the practitioners and the staff on the State Tax Commission. Anyone, Ms. Nyman, any reaction to that or further discussion about practitioner perception of the Tax Commission?
Well, unfortunately, as I was looking at that report a little bit, I didn't get a full copy, but I was looking briefly. I saw that there weren't that many respondents. It seemed like maybe there were 300 to 400 people that responded, and so it's possible that those who responded were those who were upset. If you consider all the practitioners in Idaho, I would say that's a very low percentage of practitioners that actually did respond. In my experience, I have not had specific negative instances with the Tax Commission, but from other practitioners, I have heard instances that the Tax Commission is more aggressive in collections than the IRS, and so that may be one thing. One thing that I have personally noticed, though, is that the Idaho State Tax Commission is very good about trying to help get some of those early issues resolved. For instance, if a W-2 isn't matching, they sometimes will just call and say, hey, I think there was an issue with this. Can you guys just fax over a copy of the W-2? And we get it resolved right there. The IRS does not do that. Same thing with like some K-1s, and there is transparency, like has been mentioned here in having this, the negotiated rules and in the meetings around the state with practitioners and with training and education, and so those are things that the Tax Commission provides that I don't see with the IRS. So, you know, it's a report. There was 300 people that responded to that, and I think it's important to look at that, but then also step back and say, is this indicative of the whole population? I'm not sure it is.
Okay, I see a light on. Commissioner Roberts.
Well, number one, I think we did welcome the report. I think it's always good to take a look from a third party about the operation and the function of any agency, any state agency. I think the numbers did report that maybe the Commission had a view of itself a little bit higher than other folks, and that might be appropriate or would maybe be expected. I think there are a number of recommendations. I talked about 3 of them in my presentation where we can, make the information available in more readily available format. I think it's going to be a task for us to take on and fully digest the report and say, what is it that the legislature is looking for when it comes to the need for a taxpayer advocacy, and see what the data shows. So we need to sit down with legislators and say very specifically, what type of data are you looking for from the Tax Commission when it comes to these types of issues. So I think all of us as commissioners look forward to working with legislators on what that resolution looks like. And I think it's very appropriate to report to the legislature on an annual basis about complaints, types of issues that we're feeling with appeals and how those appeals are being resolved. I think that's good information for policymakers to see.
Okay. To the extent, or did I cut somebody off? Okay. To the extent that tax returns are not accurate, they tend to understate the correct tax. However, some returns overstate the correct tax. Currently, returns are selected for audit based on their revenue potential. As a matter of both openness and balance, could a few returns be selected for their refund potential?
Well, I'll take that one again. I think we want, and we've talked a lot about this internally within the department about there was a lot of expectations put on the commission I mean, even when I was a legislator, about the initiative and the tax gap, and it was all revenue or return on investment potential. If we invest X dollars as a legislative body into the tax commission, what's it going to return? How many dollars are out there? And you heard Commissioner Langhorst say today that there's $50-some million collected over a 3-year process. So revenue, a return on investment and revenue numbers kind of drove the train, drove the commission, and that was what was expected. Now, maybe instead of the biggest number, maybe the right number is the way we should manage. And not saying that we're not getting the right number today, but if there is a refund due, in fact, across my desk today, one of the ones that rotated amongst our desks today was a refund. It was just one that where after the audit had gone through, the taxpayer was due a sizable amount of money, and that check will go out the door to that taxpayer. So it's not something that never happens, but I think we need to look at it from a balanced view to make sure we get the right number.
Okay. Commissioner Langhorst?
This is a question we've been dealing with internally, and it's become a mantra of ours. We want to find the right number, not the highest revenue dollar. And so one of the questions posed by staff is, do we go looking for refund returns? And what I've come to learn in my 5 years is that there are many places in tax law, right or wrong, that it is the burden is on the taxpayer to file properly. And so the question would be, and it would be a unique program, I don't think there's anything like it anywhere, where the taxpayers are asked to fund resources for us to go find some folks who didn't fill out their return properly and were owed some money. So it sounds nice, but I think that's the reason why you don't see that anywhere.
Could I slip in at least one or two more quick questions? An easy one for you, Commissioner Langhorst. There is this raspberry stand in Pocatello. Would you talk a little bit about that and the Commission's perspective on that? Maybe fill the audience in a little bit on my very vague and indirect reference.
So we've had a couple of incidents over time involving enforcement of people who should have temporary seller's permits. One of those was a pumpkin seller in Lewiston that you might have read about. We call it Pumpkin Gate for shorthand. And these crop up every now and then. And the question is asked of us, how can you evil taxpayers, you collectors, go out, and harass a kid who's just trying to make a few bucks to buy a bike or whatever it might be? And it's a compelling story. A lot of times there's a lot of other facts behind the story that mitigate, but let's just say that it is true, that it's just a kid and they're just trying to raise money to buy a bike or whatever. Just down the street is a store owner who's selling pumpkins, and he's having to collect the tax. Do we want to put it, in other words, if the law says that if you're selling these, you should get a temporary seller's permit and collect and remit the sales tax. So is it going to become our judgment when someone is cute enough or young enough or doing it for the right purpose enough that we get to decide we're not going to enforce the law over here? And how do we explain that to the grocer a block away? And so if the legislature does want us to do that differently, they have the ability to rewrite the law. But our people are tasked with going out and trying, again, to make a level playing field for everyone. And so that's why these things happen. There are there are facts behind some of these cases that I can't speak about. This is one of the problems with being a tax commission employee, that there can be claims, all kinds of claims about you did this or, my poor grandmother that. And there's no way that we can talk to you about it. We don't, there are extenuating circumstances, perhaps, but we can never share that side of things. So that does occur, though, sometimes with these hyped-up media stories.
Okay, thank you. And we are just about ready to close. Any closing comments from our legislators on our session? Any final word that you would like to share with us? Senator Rice?
You know, this is for the staff that deals with the taxpayers directly, especially probably more than management, because management gets to sit back sometimes and not do as much. But I like saying things like that because I get good reactions out of management. But thank you for what you do. Thank you for doing your best to be fair, to be polite, even when it's somebody yelling and screaming at you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to echo what Senator Rice said, and I'd like to say I think the Tax Commission does a good job. I think a lot of the issues that the public has with taxes are issues that are properly addressed to the legislature. One of the big problems that I think we have with the tax code, and you know, I think I've contributed to the problem. We have a lot of exemptions. We have a complicated law. We don't just have one tax. We've got a multiplicity of taxes. Taxes are so complicated, ordinary people and not so ordinary people hire accountants to figure it out for them. The days when I could do my tax return at my kitchen table are so far back there that it's just really hard to remember. This is extremely complex stuff, and one of the things that really frustrates the public is how complex it is and how hard it is to understand, and the fact that they're paying money and they don't really understand it. And they always kind of feel, I think, I used to feel this way before I became more knowledgeable about it. You kind of feel like you're the guy that's getting the bill because everybody else was smart enough not to pay it or not to pay much of it. And so they're just inherent things about this area that I think are not layable to the commissioners or the commission's employees. They represent a political problem that we have about taxes in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll turn this back to Commissioner Katsoulides.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Senator Rice and Representative Burgoyne, for those kind words to our employees. We appreciate that very much. We couldn't agree more. The tax commission employees are some of the finest employees that the state of Idaho has, and they're dedicated. They stay there for a long time because they like the work, and it's a real family over there, and they do a tremendous job. So thanks for those kind words. We appreciate it. Did want to recognize Senator Davis, who's popped in. Thank you for attending, Senator. Great to see you again. And is there anything else anybody would like to add? I hope we got some questions from our email process through the internet, and if not, you're certainly welcome to go ahead and continue asking some questions through the online process at tax.idaho.gov, and it'll link you down to an email link that you can ask a question of us. So we appreciate that, and we'll have that link up for the next couple weeks. And I did want to thank everybody else for coming to the meeting today. We certainly appreciate it. We hope it's been informative and helpful. And if we don't have anything else, we'll be happy to see you again next year. Thank you.
This is Idaho in Session, Legislature Live, the Auditorium channel. Idaho in Session is sponsored by the Idaho State